Ian Blackford, obviously raging about the prospect of either of the candidates becoming Prime Minister, but particularly for Boris Johnson. But actually, aren't you relishing the idea of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, seeing as he helps make your argument for Scottish independence? No. A panel-based poll in the Sunday Times Scotland last weekend found support for independence would jump to 53% if Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, giving the Yes campaign a clear 6-point lead.
Indeed, and that same polling exercise showed support for independence in general up at 49% within the margin of error.
That would give you a clear lead.
This is increasing things, but let's just be clear, there is no good Tory Prime Minister for Scotland, and either of the two candidates that are up there at the moment would do harm. We know that we heard Jeremy Hunt the other day saying that he'd be willing to sacrifice businesses who rely on the EU, and that was something he said, and we've seen Boris Johnson's view on the way that we need to take these things forward in an equally abhorrent way. So there is no good Tory Prime Minister for Scotland. We've been ignored all the way through the Brexit process. People in Scotland are very alive to that. Since the 62% of the people voted Remain, we've seen all the way through the process, Scottish Government ignored, Scottish Parliament ignored, MPs ignored, and all the way down. So Scotland knows it's being ignored.
Right, but do you accept you'd have a much greater chance of winning another independence referendum?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we've got a much better chance of winning an independence referendum anyway. That's what I'm saying. Because of what people have seen, it's put things into sharp focus about the way that Westminster, and I've got to say in particular the Tories, just don't care about Scotland at all. And we've seen that all the way through this process.
Right, and that is part of the reason, or even the whole reason, for that lead in that poll. No. I know there's a health warning with polls, but even so, does that concern you that actually, with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, you risk the Union?
Opportunities for the Scottish whisky sector, for Scottish farmers. You know, there will be huge opportunities.
We could do with paying the farmers
for fishing,
for a start. Well, from the European funding that didn't come through to Scotland, that should have done. And why is it, if that's the case, if the Tories are doing so well, why is it during the EU elections that the Tories actually got their lowest results since they started calling themselves the Scottish Conservatives?
Boris is firmly committed to the Union. And
well, you say that, but actually he's on record as saying that the Barnett formula needed to be rethought, and that's the amount and the proportion of money that goes to be Scotland, so that more money, he says, would come back to London. His support for reducing the number of Scottish MPs, how's that going to win people round in Scotland?
Well, you know, I think where the Barnett formula is concerned, there are issues over the fact that when the Westminster government agrees a big new policy that's in the interest of the United Kingdom, that the Scottish government will take their element of it under the Barnett formula and use it for something completely different.
Well, again, I think this just shows why the Tories are so out of touch in Scotland and why they're doing so badly, and why the SNP have won every single election recently. All the polling results shows that we're doing well. That, in fact, actually, if you look at the EU elections, a record percentage of the vote across Europe, and again underlining the mandate to look after Scotland's interest. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain, and we're opposing Brexit because, contrary to what Andrea says, there is no good Brexit. Her own government's analysis shows that every single version of Brexit will harm the economy. In Scotland, a hard Brexit would be up to 100,000 jobs.
Is on that referendum. And yet the 2014 referendum on independence showed very clearly a significant majority of Scots want to remain part of the United Kingdom.
We would secure our place in the European Union. That was what the people of Scotland were told at the time during that vote. Andrea, that's why the Tories are so out of touch. They don't understand what's going on in Scotland, and they're not listening, ignoring Scotland all the way through this process.
If the SNP is doing so well, and actually there is such an appetite for independence, and you are starting to really make that case, why hasn't the party given a firm commitment to actually holding another referendum? Well, I mean, you have again held out the possibility, dangling it in front of your supporters without a firm commitment.
There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment to set the referendum in process. Until these things are in place, you can't actually have a referendum until it's there. But in 2016, the Scottish Government won 46.5% of the vote, the biggest percentage vote share of any UK party since, I think, 1966, on a mandate of holding an independence referendum if there was a material change. And we've seen a material change in the UK over Brexit. In this particular situation.
And you're going to get a new Prime Minister very shortly. So wouldn't that be the point at which... But that would be the point, won't it, to say when you're going to have an independence
Well,
referendum?
that may well be the point to say that. I don't make that call personally.
But would you like to hear it then?
Look, I'm an SNP person. I've been a believer in independence for many, many years. So, of course, I want to see the quickest possible route for us to be able to look after our own affairs and be an equal partner in the European Union. Of course, I'd want to.
And it's difficult for the Labour Party because Scottish Labour officially supports a second BrExit referendum or EU referendum. So it's difficult for Labour to argue against another independence referendum. But how can they argue against giving the SNP another independence referendum when they want to have another EU referendum?
I'm not arguing against, the technicalities of having another referendum.
Now, hang on, you just said you're not against the technicalities of another independence referendum. Are you suggesting then that Labour would allow another referendum to take place in Scotland? Because, of course, one of the curiosities about this is it is within a Westminster government's gift to grant one or not. If Labour were in power, would they allow one?
Right now, people don't want one, so no.
That's not the...
It's, when we see that, there's polls, but there's no clear majority. That's not what people want.
That's not entirely the case, is it? Because the most recent polls in the Sunday Times are showing that people do have an appetite for independence. And in fact, polling something around 60% in Scotland showing that not only should the Scottish Government decide when we should have a referendum, but there should be a referendum in the future on Scottish independence. So it's not quite the same. We can all knock on selected doors.
Right, but it's not in the gift at the moment of the Scottish Government. Andrea, a recent YouGov poll of Conservative Party members showed 63% would rather see Scotland independent than abandon Brexit. So, in other words, your membership's just not that bothered anymore about losing Scotland. They want Brexit, but they don't mind about losing Scotland, according to that poll. You haven't done enough, have you, to earn that unionist label?
Question, though, Andrea. If it comes to it, would you, as a Conservative, choose leaving the European Union, which you believe so passionately in, or trying to keep Scotland in the UK?
But that's a nonsense. What I'm saying is there will not be a second referendum on Scottish independence. In all circumstances.
The premise for a referenda should be correct. In other words, people shouldn't be sold a bill of goods, as we were, for example, in 2014, when we were told the only way to retain our European EU membership was to vote no. Again, in the same way you said about Scotland not being ignored, what action was taken over the Scottish Government's Our Place in Europe document when it was put forward to the UK Government after Brexit?
Ian Blackford last week called Boris Johnson a racist. This week in the Chamber has called him a liar. Is that acceptable?
Well, I think if you can't tell the truth in what should be the Parliament of the United Kingdom, where can you tell the truth? These are facts. Well, we know that, I'd like to see somebody defend the case that Boris hasn't made racist comments or that Boris hasn't told lies. These are facts.
Well, the Speaker reprimanded Ian Blackford last week for unparliamentary language. Should he have intervened on this occasion when he was called a serial liar?
Well, when there is unparliamentary language, it is for the Speaker to intervene. The behaviour in the Chamber is a matter for the Chair.
Where's Jeremy Corbyn on this? Why is it the former Labour leader who is making the strong case here for the Union?
Oh, Jeremy's been in Scotland plenty. I've hosted him in Midlothian and was really popular in Scotland. But Gordon has such a unique perspective because he, of course, led a fantastic campaign throughout the Scottish independence referendum.
So why is Labour, if you're obviously supportive of a more conciliatory approach then, why is it in the most recent elections that you're going backwards in Scotland?
Not conciliatory approach, but just looking at the actual issues, things.
But why have you gone backwards then in Scotland? The approach isn't working, whichever way you look at it.
Well, I'm sitting here as an elected MP, that's progress. So when I'm out...
Fifth in Scotland in the European elections. I mean, that unimaginable a few years ago, that the Labour Party, the party of Gordon Brown and so many other, distinguished Scottish Labour politicians of recent history, it was unthinkable to imagine Labour would have been in 5th place. What is going on there?
A no confidence motion. If it is called in September, which certainly Labour is thinking about once the new Prime Minister is in place, do you believe there are as many as a dozen Tory MPs who would vote against a new Conservative government to avoid no deal?
No, I don't believe there are.
You don't?
No.